The October sky above Portland had been threatening all morning, heavy clouds rolling in from the west like bruised promises. Elena Hayes pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the rental car, the unfamiliar weight of her camera bag cutting into her shoulder. 4 years. 4 years since she'd last walked these rain-slicked streets, and the city still smelled exactly the same coffee-wet cedar and something indefinably green that seemed to seep from every corner. She hadn't meant to come back. Not ever. But life had a way of dragging you back to the places you'd tried hardest to forget, usually when you were least prepared to face them. The letter from Sarah was still folded in her jacket pocket, the paper soft from being read and reread. Elena, I need you. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. I know you'll want to run again, but please don't. I'm all the family you have left, and you're all I have. Come home. P.S. I found something of yours. Something I think you'll want to see. Elena had been living as Elena Hayes for 4 years now, building a quiet life in Seattle, restoring old buildings for preservation societies. Safe work, anonymous work, work that let her hide behind other people's histories instead of confronting her own. But Sarah's letter had shattered that carefully constructed distance in a single paragraph. Sarah Chen wasn't really her sister. They weren't even related by blood. But she was the closest thing to family Elena had left in the world, and now she was dying. The first drops of rain began to fall as Elena locked the car, fat droplets that splattered against the pavement like tears. She needed to find Sarah's apartment, needed to see how bad things really were, but first she had a stop to make. There was an address Sarah had included in her letter, an address that made no sense. 1247 Hawthorne Boulevard. Go there first. You'll understand when you see it. Elena pulled out her phone to check the GPS, but the screen was immediately speckled with raindrops. The shower was intensifying rapidly the way Pacific Northwest storms like to do 1 minute, a light mist the next, a proper downpour. She looked around frantically for shelter and spotted a building across the street with a deep overhang. Perfect. She ran. Daniel Cross was already under the overhang when the woman in the charcoal coat came running through the rain. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes watching the building and trying to work up the courage to go inside. The Moonrise Cafe. Number 15 on his list of Portland's forgotten stories, and possibly the most important one. He shifted his camera bag to make room as she joined him under the narrow shelter, both of them breathing hard from their sprint through the sudden downpour. She was older than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that was now dampened and curling around her face. Asian features, delicate but strong. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. Came out of nowhere, she said, pushing wet hair back from her forehead. Always does in Portland, Daniel replied. You'd think after 32 years I'd remember to carry an umbrella. She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. I used to live here, 4 years ago. Somehow I forgot about the rain. How do you forget about Portland rain? That's like forgetting about gravity. Practice, she said quietly, and something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. She was studying the building behind them with an odd expression, part recognition, part disbelief. The Moonrise Cafe was an unusual structure, drawing clean lines and unexpected angles that somehow managed to feel both modern and timeless. The large windows were divided by thin strips of dark wood, and the overhang where they stood was supported by columns that curved inward like parentheses. Beautiful building, Daniel said, following her gaze. Architectural firm that designed it went out of business before it was finished. Sat empty for 3 years before someone finally completed the construction. She turned to look at him, something sharp and startled in her expression. How do you know that? I'm a photographer. I specialize in buildings with stories. This one, he paused, studying the structure again. This one has more story than most. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the overhang above them with increasing intensity. Elena? She was Elena. Elena now had to remember that felt something cold and heavy settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. What kind of stories? She asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. The architect who designed this building was a professor at PSU, William Chen. He died in a car accident 4 years ago, just after submitting the final plans. His colleagues said he'd been working on it obsessively in his final months, like it was the most important thing he'd ever done. Elena's breath caught. She knew she should say something, anything, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. The strange thing is, Daniel continued, none of his students remember him working on a commercial project. All his assignments that semester were theoretical, academic exercises. But here it is. He gestured toward the building, built exactly according to his plans. Maybe, Elena's voice came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. Maybe it was a personal project. Maybe, but who funded it and why this location? The property was donated anonymously to the city with the specific instruction that it be used for this building. Nothing else, just this one design. Elena stared at the familiar curves of the roof line, the way the windows caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. She knew every line of this building because she had drawn them. Every angle, every proportion, every deliberate choice in the flow of space and light. This had been her senior thesis project, her love letter to sustainable urban design. She'd worked on it for months, staying up until 3 in the morning in the studio, surviving on coffee, and the quiet pride in Professor Chen's voice when he said it was some of the best work he'd ever seen from an undergraduate. She'd turned it in 2 days before the accident. The barista inside says Professor Chen used to come by every day after they opened, Daniel was saying. He'd sit at the corner table with a cup of coffee and just look around, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Elena closed her eyes. She could picture it perfectly, Professor Chen, in his cardigan, in wire-rimmed glasses, his salt and pepper hair, always slightly mussed from running his hands through it when he was thinking. He'd had a way of looking at buildings like they were living things, like they had souls. "You said you're a photographer," she managed to say. "Are you documenting the building?" "In a way, I'm working on a project called Forgotten Stories. Buildings that have been overlooked or abandoned places where something significant happened, but nobody talks about it anymore." Daniel shifted his weight, and she noticed he favored his left leg slightly. "This building, there's something about it that feels like it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to figure out." The rain was beginning to ease, shifting from a downpour to a steady pattering. Elena knew she should leave, should make her excuses, and go find Sarah's apartment, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Being here, seeing her building, Professor Chen's building, brought back a flood of memories she'd spent 4 years trying to bury. "I should go," she said finally. "Wait." Daniel turned toward her, and for the first time she got a good look at his face. Strong jaw, dark hair that was getting longer than it should be, and eyes that were a startling shade of green. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that made her stomach clench with a fear she couldn't name. "I didn't get your name." She hesitated. Elena Hayes was her legal name, now had been for 4 years. But standing here in front of the building she designed as Emma Chen, the lie felt heavier than usual. "Elena," she said finally. "Elena Hayes." Daniel Cross. He extended his hand, and when she shook it, his fingers were warm despite the cold rain. "Listen, this might sound strange, but would you be interested in seeing more of the building? I have permission from the owner to photograph the interior and, well, you seem to appreciate architecture." Every instinct Elena had developed over the past 4 years screamed at her to say no. To walk away, find Sarah, and keep her head down until she could figure out how to handle whatever was happening. But Sarah's words echoed in her mind. "You'll understand when you see it." Maybe this was what Sarah had meant. Maybe this was what she was supposed to find. "All right," she heard herself saying. "I'd like that." The interior of the Moonrise Cafe was exactly as Elena had imagined it, and somehow completely different. Her drawings had been precise, technical, focused on light flow and traffic patterns and the mathematical relationship between form and function. But seeing it realized, seeing people actually using the space she'd created was like watching a song she'd hummed alone become a symphony. The main room was dominated by a long counter that curved like a river following the natural flow of movement from the entrance. The ceiling soared upward in a series of angular planes that caught and redirected the light from the tall windows, creating pockets of brightness and shadow that shifted throughout the day. Even on a gray afternoon like this one, the space felt luminous. "Beautiful work," Daniel murmured, raising his camera. Whoever designed this understood how people actually move through space. Elena watched him work, noting how he moved around the room like he was learning its rhythm. He photographed details she'd never considered: the way the barista's hands looked as they worked under the specialized lighting. She'd specified the pattern raindrops made on the windows she'd positioned to frame the street beyond. "You photograph like you're listening," she said when he paused to change lenses. "Buildings talk if you know how to hear them. This one," he gestured around the room, "this one has a lot to say." A young man behind the counter, tall Asian with paint-stained fingers that suggested he was an artist as well as a barista, waved them over. "You must be the photographer Jake told me about," he said to Daniel. "I'm Kevin. Jake said you're documenting the building." "Something like that. This is Elena. She's consulting on the project." Elena shot him a surprised look, but Kevin was already talking again. "Cool. You know, it's funny, we get a lot of people in here asking about the building, mostly architecture students from PSU. They all want to know who really designed it." "What do you mean, who really designed it?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Well, Professor Chen gets the credit, obviously. But there are rumors that it was actually a student project he developed. Some of the design elements are really sophisticated too. Sophisticated for a professor who usually worked on institutional buildings, you know. This has the fingerprints of someone young, someone who was thinking outside traditional commercial constraints." Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Do people know which student?" "Nah, it's all speculation. Though," Kevin leaned against the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Jake, he's the owner. He has this theory that it was someone from Professor Chen's final semester. Someone who disappeared right after graduation. He thinks maybe something happened to them and Professor Chen finished their project as a kind of memorial." Daniel had gone very still beside her, his camera hanging forgotten in his hands. "Disappeared how?" he asked quietly. "Just vanished. Graduated summa cum laude, and then fell off the face of the earth. No job applications, no grad school, no forwarding address. Like they were running from something." Elena's hands were shaking now. She pressed them against her thighs, hoping Daniel wouldn't notice. That's quite a theory," she managed to say. "Yeah, well, Jake's got a lot of theories. He's been obsessed with this building since he bought it. Says it feels like it's waiting for something." Kevin glanced around the cafe, which was filling up now that the rain had stopped. "Hey, you should talk to him. He's in the office upstairs if you want to meet him." Daniel looked at Elena. "What do you think?" She wanted to say no, wanted to run back to her car and drive straight to Seattle and forget she'd ever come back to Portland. But Sarah was dying, and this building, her building, was somehow connected to whatever Sarah wanted her to find. "Sure," she said. "Let's meet Jake." Jake Morrison was not what Elena had expected. She'd been picturing someone older, more academic, the type of person who bought buildings to preserve their historical significance. Instead, Jake was maybe 25 with bright blue hair and tattoos covering both arms. He was sitting behind a desk covered in architectural drawings and historical documents, a laptop open in front of him displaying what looked like city planning archives. "The photographer," he said when Kevin brought them up, "and the consultant. Elena, right?" "Right." Elena shook his outstretched hand, noting the calluses that suggested he did more than sit behind a desk. "Jake's been researching the building's history," Kevin explained. "Show them the timeline you've been working on." Jake swiveled his laptop around so they could see the screen. It displayed a detailed timeline starting in 2019 and running through 2024 with dozens of entries marked in different colors. "October 2019, Professor William Chen begins working on mysterious commercial project," Jake read aloud. "December 2019. Chen's teaching assistant reports professor working excessive hours, seems emotionally invested in project. February 2020, Chen submits building proposal to City Planning Committee. March 2020, car accident, Chen dies." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity. She'd been driving to campus for her thesis presentation when the call came. Sarah crying so hard she could barely speak, telling her that Professor Chen was gone. April 2020, unknown benefactor purchases property and provides full funding for construction. Jake continued. Construction begins immediately using Chen's exact specifications. June 2022, building completed and donated to city for public use. September 2022, I buy it from the city to operate as cafe. Daniel was studying the timeline intently. Do you know who the benefactor was? That's the million-dollar question. The funding came through a law firm in Seattle, but they won't reveal their client. All they'll say is that it was someone who knew Professor Chen personally and wanted to see his final project completed. Elena's mouth went dry. Seattle. Sarah lived in Seattle now, had lived there since. The really interesting part, Jake went on, is what I found in the building when I bought it. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. These were hidden in a wall cavity in the basement. Building plans, design sketches, correspondence. Some of it's in Professor Chen's handwriting, but some of it isn't. He spread several sheets across the desk. Elena recognized her own handwriting, immediately notes she'd scribbled in the margins of her drawings, calculations she'd worked out late at night when the studio was empty. Her heart was beating so loud she was sure Daniel could hear it. This handwriting, Jake said, pointing to one of her notes, appears throughout the documents. Whoever wrote this was intimately involved in the design process, but it's not Professor Chen's hand. Daniel picked up one of the drawings, a detailed elevation of the front facade, with Elena's notes about window placement and natural light optimization. Have you tried to track down who this might be? I've been working on it for 2 years. I know it was one of Professor Chen's students from his final semester, but the university won't release class rosters without a legal reason. And honestly, Jake leaned back in his chair. I'm not sure I want to push too hard. Whoever this person is, they clearly didn't want to be found. Elena's hands were shaking again. She could feel Daniel watching her, could sense his photographer's eye cataloging her reactions. She needed to get out of here before she gave herself away completely. This is fascinating, she said, standing abruptly. But I should really get going. I have an appointment. Daniel stood as well, but his movement was slower, more reluctant. Of course, thank you for showing us this, Jake. No problem. Hey, if either of you turns up any information about the mystery student, let me know. I'd love to solve this puzzle. Elena nodded mutely and headed for the stairs, Daniel following behind her. The cafe felt different now, less like a warm refuge and more like a trap she'd walked into willingly. She pushed through the front door and out into the gray afternoon, breathing deeply of the rain-washed air. Elena, wait. She turned to find Daniel standing just outside the cafe entrance, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and an unreadable expression on his face. Are you all right? You seemed upset up there. I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long day. He studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her careful composure. Would you like to get dinner sometime? I could show you more of the buildings I'm documenting. I think you'd find them interesting. Elena's first instinct was to say no, to get in her car and drive straight to Sarah's apartment and figure out how to extract herself from this situation as quickly as possible. But there was something in Daniel's expression, a kind of careful hope, that made her hesitate. And Sarah's words echoed in her mind again. You'll understand when you see it. Maybe she was supposed to be here. Maybe this was all part of whatever Sarah had planned. All right, she said finally. Dinner sounds nice. Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. Tomorrow night, there's a place downtown that serves the best Vietnamese food in the city. Very casual. Perfect. Should I meet you there? Actually, Daniel hesitated. Would you mind if I picked you up? I know that sounds old-fashioned, but I'd like to show you something on the way. Another building. One that I think might interest you even more than the moonrise. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. What building? A house. Built in 1923 but extensively renovated in 2020. The renovation work was unusual. Whoever did it had a very specific vision for how space and light should work together. Sound familiar? He knew. Somehow, despite all her careful precautions, Daniel Cross knew exactly who she was. Elena forced herself to keep breathing, to keep her expression neutral. That does sound interesting. Where should you pick me up? Daniel reached into his camera bag and pulled out a small notebook, tearing out a page and writing on it. What's your address? She gave him Sarah's address, the apartment where she'd be staying while she figured out what was happening with her sister's illness and how much trouble she was in. 8 o'clock, Daniel asked, handing her the paper with his phone number written on it. 8 o'clock, Elena agreed. As she walked back to her car, Elena could feel Daniel watching her. She waited until she was around the corner before pulling out her phone and calling Sarah. Elena, Sarah's voice was weaker than it had been in their last conversation, but still warm with affection. You came. I'm here. Sarah, what the hell is going on? Why did you send me to that building? Did you see it? Did you see what he built for you? Professor Chen is dead, Sarah. He's been dead for 4 years. I know. Sarah's voice was quiet now, tired. Come home, Elena. Come see me. There's so much I need to tell you. Lena closed her eyes, leaning against her car in the gray afternoon light. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Lena, be careful who you trust, but also, don't be afraid to trust anyone. You've been alone too long. When the line went dead, leaving Elena standing in the rain with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed new life was about to collapse entirely. But as she drove through the familiar streets towards Sarah's apartment, one thought kept circling through her mind. Daniel Cross had seemed to recognize the building instantly, had known details about its construction that weren't public knowledge. He'd spoken about forgotten stories and buildings with secrets. What if he wasn't just documenting the Moonrise Cafe? What if he was documenting her? Sarah's apartment was in a converted Victorian in the Alberta district, a neighborhood that had transformed dramatically since Elena had left Portland. The building was painted sage green with white trim, and climbing roses covered the front porch despite the late season. Elena found Sarah's unit on the second floor and knocked softly. When the door opened, she barely recognized her sister. Sarah had always been small, but now she looked fragile in a way that made Elena's chest ache. Her hair, once long and glossy black, had been cut short and was covered by a colorful head wrap. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of long nights and difficult treatments. But her smile was exactly the same, bright and mischievous and full of love. Elena, she said, and then she was in Elena's arms, feeling like bird bones and fierce determination. God, Sarah, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you would have come sooner and you weren't ready yet. Sarah pulled back and studied Elena's face. You're still not ready, but we're out of time. Sarah's apartment was small, but carefully arranged, every surface covered with books and artwork and photographs. Elena recognized some of the pictures of the two of them from college, from the brief happy time before everything went wrong. But there were others she didn't recognize, including several shots of buildings she'd never seen before. Sit, Sarah said, settling onto a couch covered with soft blankets. Tell me about Daniel. Elena froze halfway to the chair Sarah had indicated. How do you know about Daniel? Because I've been waiting 4 years for you to meet him. Sarah, what are you talking about? Sarah reached for a manila envelope on the coffee table similar to the one Jake had shown them at the cafe. After you left, after you changed your name and disappeared, I started trying to understand what happened that night, the night of the accident. Elena's stomach clenched. Sarah, we don't need to. Yes, we do, because you've been carrying guilt for something that wasn't entirely your fault, and there are people who need to know the truth. Sarah opened the envelope and spread several photographs across the coffee table. These are from the police file. I have a friend who works in records. And the photos were exactly what Elena expected, and somehow worse than she remembered. The intersection where it had happened, the crumpled cars, the ambulances with their spinning lights painting everything red and blue. And in the background of one shot, a figure with a camera. Daniel Cross, Sarah said quietly. He was freelancing for the Portland Tribune then. He took these pictures. Elena stared at the photograph, at the man she had just spent the afternoon with, frozen in the moment of documenting the worst night of her life. He was there, she whispered. He was there. And Elena, he saw what really happened. Sarah pulled out another photograph, this one showing the intersection from a different angle. Elena could see her own car, the damage to the front end, but she could also see something else. Something she'd been too shocked and traumatized to notice that night. The other driver, Sarah said. Look at his car. Elena looked. The damage pattern was wrong. If she had run the red light, the way she'd always believed, the impact would have been different. But this? He ran the light, she said numbly. Not me. You both ran the light. But he was drunk, Elena. Blood alcohol, 3 times the legal limit. He caused the accident, and then he let you believe it was your fault. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the photograph. But Professor Chen was in the back seat of the drunk driver's car. He was being driven home from a faculty dinner. It wasn't your fault that he died, Elena. It was just terrible timing, terrible luck. But why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't the police? Because you left. You disappeared before the full investigation was complete. And the other driver died at the scene, so there was no one to prosecute. The case was closed as a tragic accident with no criminal charges filed. Elena closed her eyes, feeling 4 years of guilt and self-hatred shifting inside her like tectonic plates. Daniel knows all this. Daniel knows some of it. He knows the official version from the police report. But Elena, Sarah leaned forward, taking her hands. He's been looking for you. What do you mean? He never forgot that night. He said later that he could see you in your car, see how destroyed you were. He tried to find you afterward, tried to reach out, but you'd already changed your name and left town. He's been carrying the weight of those pictures for 4 years, just like you've been carrying guilt. Elena stared at Sarah, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That's why he knew so much about the moonrise. That's why he seemed familiar. He's not stalking you if that's what you're thinking, but when I reached out to him last month, told him about the building and about you coming back, Sarah's voice was getting weaker and she paused to catch her breath. I thought maybe you two could help each other heal. You reached out to him, Sarah. What exactly have you been doing? Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the mischievous younger sister Elena remembered. What I do best, meddling in your love life. This isn't funny. It's a little funny. Elena, you've been hiding for 4 years. You've been living half a life afraid to get close to anyone, afraid to do the work you love because it reminds you of Professor Chen. Meanwhile, Daniel's been doing the same thing, documenting other people's stories because he's afraid to face his own. Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray afternoon. He asked me to dinner tomorrow night. Good, go. Sarah, I can't. This is too complicated, too much history. That's exactly why you should go. Elena, I'm dying. Not might die, not probably going to die. I am dying and end sooner rather than later. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. I don't want to leave you alone again. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life running from ghosts. Elena turned back to her sister, tears blurring her vision. What if he hates me? What if he blames me for Professor Chen's death? Then you'll know, but Elena, what if he doesn't? That night, Elena lay awake in Sarah's guest room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain that had started up again. Her phone was on the nightstand with Daniel's number written on the scrap of paper next to it. She thought about the way he'd moved through the Moonrise Cafe, the careful attention he'd paid to the details of her design. She thought about his hands as he'd adjusted his camera settings, the quiet way he'd spoken about buildings having stories to tell. She thought about the photographs Sarah had shown her Daniel, frozen in the moment of documenting the worst night of her life, his face tense with concentration and something that might have been compassion. Most of all, she thought about the way he'd looked at her when he'd asked her to dinner, like he was hoping for something but trying not to hope too hard. At 3 in the morning, she finally reached for her phone and typed out a text message. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Thank you for showing me the building today. It meant more than you know. She sent it before she could change her mind, then set the phone aside and finally fell asleep to the sound of rain against the windows. In the morning, there was a response waiting for her. Thank you for trusting me with your reaction to it. Sleep well. Elena read the message 3 times, parsing each word for hidden meaning. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe she'd been looking for hidden meanings and ulterior motives for so long that she'd forgotten how to recognize simple kindness. Sarah was still asleep when Elena made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. She had work to do, client emails to answer, project deadlines to manage. The careful, anonymous life she'd built in Seattle was waiting for her. But first she opened a new browser window and typed Daniel Cross Photographer Portland. The search returned dozens of results. His portfolio website showed the kind of work she'd expected: architectural photography, documentary projects, some commercial shoots. But there was another section labeled personal work that made her breath catch. It was a series called Aftermath, and it was all photographs taken in the immediate wake of traumatic events. Car accidents, house fires, crime scenes, but not sensationalized or exploitative. Daniel's photographs showed these places with a kind of reverent attention, focusing on details that revealed the human impact of tragedy. A child's toy left in the rubble of a burned house, flowers placed at the site of a fatal collision, the way sunlight fell through the broken windows of an abandoned building. At the bottom of the series was a statement that made Elena's eyes burn with unshed tears. These photographs are an attempt to bear witness to moments when ordinary life intersects with tragedy. They are not meant to sensationalize suffering, but to honor the resilience of the human spirit in the way we continue to find meaning in the face of loss. Every tragedy leaves behind not just destruction, but also evidence of love, hope, and the determination to rebuild. Below that was a note. Proceeds from sales of this series are donated to victim assistance programs and trauma counseling services. Elena closed the laptop and sat in Sarah's quiet kitchen, watching the morning light filter through the windows of a building she'd never designed, but somehow felt like home. Tonight she would have dinner with Daniel Cross. She would look him in the eye and try to see him clearly, not as the photographer who had documented her worst moment, but as a man who had spent 4 years trying to find meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. She would try to be brave enough to let him see her clearly too. Outside, the rain had stopped, and for the first time in 4 years, Elena felt like the clouds might actually be lifting. Elena spent the next day moving through Sarah's apartment like a ghost, helping her sister with small tasks while trying to process everything she'd learned. Sarah was weaker than she'd admitted over the phone. She needed help getting to the bathroom, could barely manage more than a few bites of soup, and slept most of the afternoon. But in her waking moments, she was still unmistakably Sarah. Sharp, observant, and absolutely determined to meddle in Elena's life until her final breath. "You're overthinking this," Sarah said that afternoon, watching Elena pace the small living room for the dozenth time. "It's dinner, not a tribunal." "He documented the worst night of my life, Sarah. He has photographs of a car accident that wasn't your fault, of a tragedy that you both survived." Sarah shifted on the couch, wincing slightly. "Elena, stop thinking of that night as something that defines you. Start thinking of it as something that connected you to someone who might understand." Elena stopped pacing and looked at her sister. Really looked at her. Sarah's skin had the translucent quality that came with serious illness, but her eyes were still bright, still fierce with love and determination. "How long do we have?" Elena asked quietly. "Weeks, maybe a month. The doctors aren't sure." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Elena caught the slight tremor underneath. "That's why I need to know you'll be okay, that you won't disappear again when I'm gone." Elena sat down next to her sister and took her hand. It felt fragile, like holding a bird. "I'm not going anywhere. Promise me." "I promise, Mama." Sarah squeezed her fingers. "Good. Now go get ready for your date. And Elena, wear the blue dress. The one from college. I kept it for you." Daniel arrived exactly at 8, driving a well-maintained Honda that had seen better years, but was meticulously clean. Elena watched from Sarah's window as he checked his appearance in the side mirror, running a hand through his dark hair before walking up to the front door. She'd found the blue dress Sarah mentioned, a simple wrap dress in navy that she'd worn to gallery openings and architecture presentations in what felt like another lifetime. It still fit, though. She felt strange wearing clothes from her old life, like putting on a costume for a play she'd forgotten how to act in. Daniel was waiting on the front porch when she opened the door, and his expression when he saw her made something flutter in her chest. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you. So do you." He was wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt in forest green that brought out his eyes. Nothing fancy, but everything fitted well and chosen with care. Like he'd put thought into making a good impression without trying too hard. "Ready for a bit of a drive? The restaurant's downtown, but I want to show you something first." Elena nodded, following him to the car. As they pulled away from Sarah's building, she found herself studying his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. Strong jaw, slight crow's feet around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, calloused from work. "How long have you been doing the photography?" she asked. "Professionally, about 10 years. I started out in photojournalism, covering local news and events. But I got burned out on the constant crisis, the way everything had to be dramatic to be worth covering." Daniel glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "I wanted to find stories that mattered in quieter ways. Hence the building project. Hence the building project. Architecture is like frozen music. All the emotion and intention of the people who created it, preserved in stone and steel and glass." He turned onto a tree-lined street Elena didn't recognize. "Buildings don't lie. They can't pretend to be something they're not. Unlike people Elena thought but didn't say. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively more residential. Finally, Daniel pulled up in front of a craftsman-style house that made Elena's breath catch. It was beautiful, all clean lines and natural materials with a front porch that wrapped around one side and windows positioned to catch maximum light. But what made her heart race was how familiar it looked. Not the house itself, but the way it had been restored. The proportions, the attention to how indoor and outdoor spaces flowed together, the subtle way light was guided through the structure. "Whose house is this?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Mine. I bought it 3 years ago. It was in pretty rough shape. The previous owner had done some renovations in the 80s that completely destroyed the original character." Daniel turned off the engine and looked at her. "Want to see what I found when I started taking those renovations apart?" Elena followed him up the front walkway, noting details that made her increasingly uneasy. The way the porch columns had been restored, the careful placement of new windows, the addition of a side garden that created privacy without blocking light, all of it spoke of someone who understood space and flow in ways that felt intimately familiar. Daniel unlocked the front door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior took Elena's breath away. It was her work. Not copied or inspired by her aesthetic, it was her actual work. Sketches she'd drawn in her senior portfolio, ideas she'd developed in late-night studio sessions, solutions to spatial problems she'd worked out in theoretical projects that were never meant to be built. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how did you—" "I found these in the house when I bought it." He led her to a built-in bookshelf and pulled out a portfolio she recognized immediately. Her senior portfolio from PSU, the one she'd thought was lost in the chaos after graduation. Elena's hands shook as she opened it. There were her drawings, her notes, her careful studies of how to maximize natural light in small spaces, how to create flow between rooms, how to honor the original character of a building while adapting it for modern life. "The previous owner was Professor Chen," Daniel said quietly. "He bought this house in 2019, right around the time he started working on the Moonrise project. According to the neighbors, he spent months renovating it, working with contractors to implement very specific design ideas." Elena sank onto the couch, a piece she didn't recognize, but that fit perfectly with the aesthetic she'd envisioned. "He used my portfolio. He built my ideas." "Not just your ideas." "Elena." Daniel sat down beside her, careful to maintain some distance. "I think he was trying to create something for you, a place where you could live and work when you came back. But I never came back. I ran away and changed my name and tried to forget this place existed. Professor Chen didn't know that. According to university records, you were supposed to start graduate school in the fall of 2020. You'd been accepted into the master's program, had a fellowship lined up, the whole thing. And then you just disappeared." Lena closed her eyes, remembering. She'd been so excited about grad school, about working more closely with Professor Chen, about diving deeper into sustainable design. And then the accident happened, and all of that seemed impossible. How could she face him every day, knowing she was responsible for destroying his life, except she wasn't responsible? Sarah had shown her the police reports, the evidence that proved she hadn't caused the accident. But Professor Chen didn't know that when he died. He died thinking, "What did he think happened to me?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. His colleagues said he was devastated after the accident. Not just because he was injured, he had some pretty serious trauma from the crash, but because one of his most promising students had vanished right afterward. He kept asking about you, wanting to know if you were okay, if you needed help. He was asking about me. "Elena, Professor Chen wasn't just your thesis advisor. According to Sarah, he was also your emergency contact. The hospital called him when you were brought in after the accident." Elena's world tilted. "What? You don't remember you had a concussion, some bruised ribs? You were unconscious for several hours. Professor Chen came to the hospital even though he'd just been released himself. He sat with you until you woke up." Fragments of memory began surfacing, hazy images she'd assumed were dreams. Someone holding her hand in a sterile white room. A familiar voice saying her name. The scent of the cardigan Professor Chen always wore, a mixture of coffee and the vintage aftershave he favored. "I thought I dreamed it," she whispered. "Sarah found the hospital records. She's been investigating this for months, Elena. Professor Chen left specific instructions with his lawyer. If anything happened to him, his estate was to be used to complete your graduate education and to build the Moonrise Cafe. He'd already started the funding process before he died. Elena felt like she was drowning. 4 years of guilt and self-hatred, 4 years of believing she'd destroyed the life of a man who'd believed in her and all of it based on a misunderstanding. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? Because you disappeared. By the time the lawyer tried to contact you, Emma Chen no longer existed. Elena Hayes had vanished into a new life in Saddle, and there was no forwarding address. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. Professor Chen left this for you. His lawyer gave it to Sarah when she contacted him last month. Elena's name was written on the envelope in Professor Chen's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Emma, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me and you've finally come home. I hope you're well. I hope you found peace with whatever drove you away. I want you to know that I never blamed you for the accident. I know you, Emma. I know your heart, your character, your careful attention to safety in everything you do. Whatever happened that night, I know it wasn't malicious or careless. I know you've been carrying guilt you don't deserve. I'm writing this letter because I need you to know that your work matters. Your vision for how spaces can heal and inspire and bring people together, that's a gift the world needs. Don't let one tragic night take that away from you. The Moonrise Cafe is being built according to your design because it deserves to exist. Because you deserve to see your ideas come to life. Because the world needs more beauty, more thoughtful spaces, more evidence that humans can create things that make life better. The house on Laurel Street is also yours if you want it. I've renovated it according to your portfolio designs because I thought you might like to see what your ideas look like when they're lived in. If you don't want it, sell it and use the money for whatever brings you joy. But Emma, please don't disappear forever. The world has lost too much already. Don't let it lose you too. With all my love and faith in your future, Professor William Chen, P.S. Take care of Sarah. She's been worried about you. Elena read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. When she finally looked up, Daniel was watching her with an expression of such gentle understanding that she wanted to collapse into his arms. He knew, she said. He knew I was in pain, and he was trying to fix it. He loved you. Not romantically like a father loves a daughter, like a teacher loves a student who reminds him why he chose his profession. Elena folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. Sarah arranged all of this, didn't she? You finding the house, me coming back to Portland, us meeting at the cafe. Daniel nodded. She contacted me 3 months ago, told me who you really were, where you'd been, why you disappeared. She asked if I wanted to meet the person who designed the building that I'd been photographing. And you said yes. I said yes, but yet Elena, not because she asked me to, because I'd been hoping to find you for 4 years. The honesty in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something that suggested his interest in her went beyond professional curiosity or Sarah's matchmaking. Why? She asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. The night of the accident, I saw you in your car afterward. You were conscious, but you looked broken, like someone who'd just watched the world end. I wanted to help, but the paramedics were already there, and then you disappeared. He stood up and walked to the window looking out at his front garden. I've photographed a lot of accidents, a lot of tragedies. Most people in crisis look angry or scared or confused. But you look like someone who was drowning in guilt. And I kept thinking about that expression, wondering what had happened to you, whether you were okay. So when Sarah contacted me and told me who you were, told me about the buildings you designed and the work you'd done before the accident, I realized I'd been carrying pieces of your story for 4 years without knowing it. Elena joined him at the window. The house across the street had warm lights in the windows, and she could see the silhouettes of a family moving around inside normal people, living normal lives, unaware that 2 strangers were standing in the dark talking about tragedy and forgiveness and the strange ways people find each other. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. Do what? Trust someone. Let someone care about me. I've been alone for so long, and it's felt safer that way. Daniel turned to face her. Elena, I'm not asking you to trust me completely right away. I'm not asking you to solve 4 years of isolation in one evening. I'm just asking if you want to go get dinner and see what happens. She studied his face in the dim light from the street. He was handsome, yes, but that wasn't what made her heart race. It was the careful way he spoke, the thoughtful attention he paid to her reactions, the sense that he saw her clearly and wasn't afraid of what he saw. I want to see the rest of the house first, she said. Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. I was hoping you'd say that. The tour of the house was like walking through her own imagination made real. Every room reflected ideas she'd sketched but never expected to see, built the way the kitchen opened onto a small breakfast nook, with windows positioned to catch morning light, the reading corner with built-in shelves and a window seat, the master bedroom with a bathroom that felt like a spa retreat. But it was the studio that made her cry. Professor Chen had converted what must have been a spare bedroom into a perfect architectural workspace, drafting table positioned for optimal, natural light storage for supplies and reference materials, a corkboard for pinning up inspiration images. On the drafting table was a set of blueprints for the Moonrise Cafe marked with notes in Professor Chen's handwriting. He was still working on it, Elena said, studying the drawings. Even after he finished the official plans, he was still refining details. Sarah said he told people he was designing it for someone special, someone who would understand what he was trying to achieve. Elena ran her fingers over the drawings, seeing her own aesthetic reflected in every line, but refined by Professor Chen's experience and wisdom. It was collaborative work, even though she'd never known they were collaborating. I never got to thank him, she said. I never got to tell him how much his teaching meant to me. I think he knew. I think that's why he did all this. They stood in the studio together, surrounded by the evidence of Professor Chen's faith in her future. Elena felt something shifting inside her. Not the heavy weight of guilt she'd carried for 4 years, but something lighter. Not absolution exactly, but possibility. Daniel, she said finally, I want to tell you about that night, about what really happened. You don't have to. I want to. I need to. If we're going to. She paused, not sure how to finish that sentence. If we're going to be friends, you should know the truth. Daniel nodded and led her back to the living room. They sat on the couch with the lights turned low and the city quiet outside, and Elena told him everything. About the faculty dinner she'd been driving home from, about the intersection where both cars ran the red light, about the terrible moment of impact and the confusion afterward. About waking up in the hospital with fragmented memories and the growing certainty that she'd caused a tragedy. About the guilt that had driven her to change her name and flee to Seattle, where she could hide behind other people's restoration projects instead of creating anything new. Daniel listened without interrupting his attention, complete and non-judgmental. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The other driver, he said finally, Richard Morrison. I remember him from that night. He wasn't someone you'd want to meet under the best circumstances. What do you mean? He had a history, multiple DUIs, suspended license, history of domestic violence. He should never have been driving that night, and he definitely shouldn't have had Professor Chen in his car. Elena frowned. How do you know all this? Daniel hesitated. Because I followed up on the story. After you disappeared, after the case was closed, I couldn't let it go. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, not the accident itself, but the way it was handled afterward. What did you find? Morrison had been drinking at the same faculty dinner you'd left. He'd been asked to leave by university security, but Professor Chen felt sorry for him. Morrison was an adjunct instructor struggling financially, going through a messy divorce. Professor Chen offered him a ride home. Elena felt sick. So Professor Chen died because he was trying to help someone. Professor Chen died because Richard Morrison made a series of terrible choices. The accident was Morrison's fault, Elena. The police report makes that clear even if you never saw it. But I was drinking too. Not much, but you were under the legal limit. Morrison was 3 times over. You might have both run the red light, but only one of you was driving drunk. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the last pieces of her 4-year guilt complex crumbling. It didn't make Professor Chen any less dead, didn't erase the tragedy of that night, but it meant she could stop carrying responsibility for a choice she didn't make. Sarah showed you the police report, she said. Sarah showed me everything. Hospital records, police reports, even Morrison's criminal history. She wanted me to understand what really happened before I met you. She's been planning this for months. She's been planning this since she found out she was sick. Elena Sarah doesn't just want you to be happy, she wants you to have someone who will take care of you when she's gone. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on Sarah's health, on managing her own emotions about coming back to Portland, that she hadn't fully processed the reality of what was coming. In a few weeks, maybe a month, Sarah would be gone, and Elena would be alone again. Except maybe she wouldn't be. "Is that what this is?" she asked, looking at Daniel. "Sarah trying to arrange a caretaker for me?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know what to think. This is all so overwhelming so fast." "Elena, look at me." Daniel shifted on the couch so he was facing her fully. "I'm not here because Sarah asked me to be. I'm here because when I saw your building, when I understood what you'd created, I wanted to know the person who could design something that beautiful. I'm here because when Sarah told me your story, I recognized something in it that felt familiar. And I'm here because when I met you yesterday, even before I knew who you were, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." "What?" "Hope, interest. The possibility that someone might understand what it's like to carry weight from the past, but still want to build something better for the future." Elena studied his face, looking for signs that he was just being kind, just playing along with Sarah's matchmaking scheme. But his expression was open and honest, and she remembered the way he'd spoken about buildings having stories about finding meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. "What's your weight?" she asked quietly. Daniel was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "I have PTSD from my years as a photojournalist, but specifically from that night. Watching Professor Chen die, seeing you in your car, taking pictures when I should have been helping, it broke something in me." Elena felt her breath catch. "Daniel." "I stopped doing news photography after that. Couldn't handle documenting other people's worst moments anymore. The building project, the Forgotten Stories series, that's all therapy, really. Trying to find ways to witness tragedy without exploiting it." "Is that why you walk with a slight limp?" Daniel looked surprised. "You notice that?" "I notice how people move through space. It's part of my training." "Car accident 6 months after the night we're talking about. I was driving to cover a story and had a panic attack behind the wheel. Ran off the road, broke my leg in 3 places." Daniel's smile was rueful. "Turns out unprocessed trauma has consequences." Elena reached out and took his hand without thinking about it. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from camera work, and they closed around hers with gentle pressure. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry that night hurt you too. We hurt each other by accident, and we've both been healing from it alone. Maybe we could try healing together." Elena looked around the living room at the careful attention to light and flow, at the evidence of Professor Chen's faith in her future, at the man sitting beside her, who'd spent 4 years carrying pieces of her story without knowing her name. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "Of what?" "Of this being too good to be true. Of Sarah's illness making everything feel more urgent than it should. Of the fact that our entire connection is based on the worst night of both our lives." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Those are all reasonable fears. Can I suggest something?" "What?" "Let's go get dinner. Let's talk about things that have nothing to do with accidents or illness or the past. Let's see if we like each other when we're not discussing tragedy." Elena smiled, feeling something loosen in her chest. "What would we talk about?" "I don't know what kind of movies you like, whether you prefer coffee or tea, what you've been working on in Seattle, whether you think pineapple belongs on pizza." "It absolutely does not. See, we're already learning important things about each other." Elena laughed, really laughed for the first time since coming back to Portland. "Okay, let's go get dinner." The restaurant Daniel had chosen was small and unassuming, tucked into a converted house in the Hawthorne district. The tables were mismatched, the lighting warm and dim, and the smell of lemongrass and ginger filled the air. "Best pho in Portland," Daniel said as they were seated at a corner table. "I discovered it about 2 years ago and haven't found anywhere better." Elena looked around the restaurant, noting the way the space had been adapted from residential to commercial use. Whoever did the renovation understood flow. See how they kept the original room divisions, but opened up sight lines between spaces? It feels like eating in someone's home. You can't turn it off, can you? The architectural analysis. Not really. It's like being a photographer once you start seeing composition everywhere you can't stop. Daniel grinned. Touché. They ordered pho for both of them, spring rolls to share, and settled into the kind of conversation Elena had forgotten was possible. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd traveled, the weird little details of their respective professions. Daniel told her about the building he was documenting next, a Depression-era theater that had been converted into a community center. Elena found herself describing the Victorian mansion she was restoring in Seattle, explaining the challenges of updating plumbing and electrical systems while preserving historical character. Do you miss it? Daniel asked, creating new things instead of just preserving old ones. Elena considered the question while twirling rice noodles around her chopsticks. I thought preservation was safer. Less ego involved, less chance of imposing my vision on the world. But seeing the moon rise today, seeing what Professor Chen did with my ideas, she paused. I forgot how good it feels to see something you've imagined become real. What would you design now if you could create anything? Housing, Elena said without hesitation. Affordable housing that doesn't look like it's apologizing for existing. Places where families can build lives and communities without sacrificing beauty or dignity. Daniel's eyes lit up. That's amazing. Portland could use that kind of vision. Seattle could too. Everywhere could. But it's complicated funding, zoning, politics. It's easier to just restore other people's dreams. Easier but not better. Elena met his gaze across the table. No, not better. They talked for 2 hours long after they'd finished eating. Elena learned that Daniel had grown up in Portland, that his parents had divorced when he was 12, that he'd originally planned to be a teacher before falling into photography. Daniel learned that Elena had been born in San Francisco, but raised in Portland after her parents died in a plane crash when she was 8, that Sarah's family had taken her in, that she'd always been drawn to architecture because she loved the idea of creating spaces where people could feel safe. Sarah isn't really your sister, Daniel said, when Elena told him about the Chen family taking her in. Not by blood, but in every way that matters. She's the only family I have left. Daniel nodded, understanding flickering in his expression. My grandmother was like that for me. Not blood family, but the person who made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Past tense. She died 3 years ago. That's part of why I bought the house. She left me some money, and I wanted to create something she would have been proud of. Elena felt a pang of recognition. We're both orphans, aren't we? Both trying to build families out of the people who choose to love us. Maybe that's why Sarah thought we'd understand each other. Elena looked around the restaurant, which was beginning to empty as the evening wound down. She felt relaxed in a way she hadn't in years, like she was remembering how to be herself around another person. Daniel, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay. Jim. Are you interested in me because of who I am or because of the guilt you've been carrying about that night? Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. A week ago, I would have said guilt. When Sarah first contacted me, when she told me who you were, I thought maybe meeting you would help me process what happened. And now I think guilt was just what got me to show up, what made me stay, what made me want to see you again. That's something else entirely. What? Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. You're brilliant. You see things other people miss. You care about creating beauty in the world, about making spaces where people can flourish. You're careful with other people's feelings, but brave enough to tell hard truths. And when you laugh, really laugh, it's like watching someone remember they're allowed to be happy. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. That's a lot to determine from one day. I'm a photographer. I'm good at reading people quickly. Elena squeezed his hand. In that case, what do your photographer instincts tell you about where this is going? Daniel smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression was completely unguarded. They tell me I'd like to find out. Daniel drove her back to Sarah's apartment, slowly taking the long way through neighborhoods Elena remembered from her college years. The city looked different at night, softer, more forgiving. Lights in windows suggested stories she'd never know, lives being lived in spaces that had their own histories and possibilities. Thank you, Elena said as they pulled up in front of Sarah's building. For dinner, for showing me the house, for all of it. Thank you for trusting me with your story. They sat in the car for a moment, neither moving to get out. Elena felt like they were standing at the edge of something significant, and once she stepped over the threshold, there would be no going back to the safety of solitude. Elena, Daniel said finally, would you like to have coffee tomorrow? There's something else I wanted to show you. What? It's a surprise, but I think you'll find it interesting from a professional standpoint. Elena studied his profile in the dim light from the street lamps. You're not going to tell me what it is. Where would be the fun in that? She smiled. All right, coffee sounds good. I'll pick you up at 10. Perfect. Elena got out of the car and walked up to the front door, aware that Daniel was waiting to make sure she got inside safely. She turned and waved before letting herself into the building, then watched from Sarah's window as his taillights disappeared down the street. Sarah was still awake when Elena came in, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and a book she wasn't really reading. How was dinner? Sarah asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. It was, Elena paused, trying to find the right words. It was nice, really nice. And he's picking me up for coffee in the morning. Sarah's smile widened. Oh, good, I like him. Sarah, what exactly have you been planning? How long have you been arranging this? Sarah patted the couch beside her and Elena sat down, noting how carefully her sister moved, how much effort even small actions required now. I've been sick for 8 months, Sarah said quietly. The first few months I was so focused on treatment that I didn't think about anything else. But when the doctors told me the chemo wasn't working, when they started talking about palliative care, that's when I started thinking about what would happen to you. Sarah, let me finish. Elena, you've been hiding for 4 years. You've built a life that's safe but not full work, that's satisfying but not challenging. You've been so afraid of causing another tragedy that you've stopped living your own life. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes. I was protecting people. You were protecting yourself. And I understand why trauma does that, makes us want to control everything so we never get hurt again. But Elena, you can't live your whole life in hiding. Sarah reached for Elena's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her illness. When I started researching the accident, when I found out what really happened that night, I realized you'd been carrying guilt for something that wasn't your fault. And when I found Professor Chen's lawyer, when I learned about everything he'd left for you, I knew I had to find a way to get you back here. So you contacted Daniel. I contacted Daniel because he was part of the story. Because he'd been carrying pieces of that night too, and I thought maybe you could help each other heal. But Elena, Sarah's voice grew softer, even if you two end up just as friends, even if nothing romantic happens, I needed to know that when I'm gone, you'll have someone in your life who understands where you came from. Elena was crying now, tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilling over. I don't want you to be gone. I know, I don't want to go, but I need to know you'll be okay when I do. Elena leaned into her sister's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of Sarah's shampoo and the slightly medicinal smell that clung to her now. They held each other in the quiet apartment, two women who'd chosen to be family preparing for a goodbye neither of them wanted to say. He invited me to see something tomorrow, Elena said eventually. Professional interest, he said. Sarah pulled back and wiped tears from Elena's cheeks. What do you think it is? I have no idea, but Sarah, I think I want to find out. Good, that's all I've ever wanted, for you to want things again. Elena looked around Sarah's apartment, at the carefully arranged books and photographs, at the evidence of a life lived with intention and love. Tomorrow she would see Daniel again, would continue this strange process of rediscovering who she might be if she stopped running from her past. Tonight she would sit with her sister and be grateful for the time they still had. Sarah, she said finally, thank you for all of this, for bringing me home. Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the young woman who'd taken Elena under her wing all those years ago, fierce and protective and full of love. Welcome home, Elena. Now let's get some sleep. You have a big day tomorrow. Outside, Portland settled into its nighttime rhythm, rain beginning to fall again in the gentle, persistent way that washed the city clean and prepared it for whatever came next. Elena woke to the sound of rain against Sarah's windows and the soft murmur of voices from the living room. For a moment, she couldn't place the second voice lower than Sarah's unfamiliar but somehow soothing. Then she remembered Daniel was picking her up for coffee this morning. But when she checked her phone, it was only 7:30. Their appointment wasn't until 10. Elena pulled on a robe and padded to the living room where she found Sarah sitting with a man she didn't recognize. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that reminded her painfully of Professor Chen. "Elena," Sarah said, looking up with a smile that seemed forced. "This is Dr. Martinez, my oncologist." Elena's stomach dropped. House calls from oncologists were never good news. "Ms. Hayes, Martinez said, standing to shake her hand. "Sarah asked me to come by this morning. She wanted to discuss her care plan with you present." Elena sat down across from them, her heart racing. "What's happened?" Sarah reached for her hand. "The pain has been getting worse. Dr. Martinez thinks it's time to consider hospice care." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd known this was coming, had been trying to prepare herself, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that took her breath away. "How long?" Elena asked quietly. "Weeks," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Maybe less. Sarah's cancer has progressed more rapidly than we initially projected." Elena looked at her sister, at the gray pallor of her skin, the way she held herself carefully, as if any sudden movement might cause pain. How had she not seen how bad things had gotten? "What does hospice care mean?" Elena asked. "Would you go to a facility?" "I want to stay here," Sarah said firmly. "In my own space with my own things." "Dr. Martinez says that's possible with the right support." "You'd need a caregiver," Dr. Martinez explained. "Someone to help with medications, daily tasks, monitoring symptoms. There are excellent hospice nurses in Portland who can provide professional care, but Sarah would also need family support." Elena nodded, her mind already racing through the practicalities. She'd have to quit her job in Seattle, find a way to break her lease, figure out how to manage her life from Portland. But none of that mattered. Sarah had taken care of her when she was lost and alone. Now it was Elena's turn. "I'll stay," Elena said. "However long you need, I'll be here." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Elena, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You're my family, Sarah. You're all the family I have." Dr. Martinez spent another hour explaining the medication schedule, symptom management, and what to expect in the coming weeks. Elena took notes, asked questions, and tried to memorize every detail, while a part of her mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that there had to be more time. After Dr. Martinez left, Elena sat with Sarah on the couch, both of them quiet and overwhelmed. "I should call Daniel," Elena said finally. "Cancel our coffee plans." "No." Sarah's voice was stronger than it had been all morning. "Elena, you're not canceling your life because I'm dying." "Sarah, I mean it. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. You'll use my illness as an excuse to stop living again, to stop taking risks, to stop opening your heart to people." Elena stared at her sister. "How can you think about dating when you're dying? That's exactly when I think about it most." "Elena, I have maybe 2 weeks left. 2 weeks to make sure you'll be okay when I'm gone. I'm not wasting that time watching you retreat back into your shell." "But what if something happens while I'm out? What if you need—" "Mrs. Patterson from downstairs is coming to sit with me. And Elena, we both know there's nothing that's going to happen today that will change the outcome of this illness." Elena closed her eyes, feeling torn between her desire to spend every possible moment with Sarah and her sister's insistence that she continue building something new with Daniel. "What am I supposed to tell him?" Elena asked. "And how do I explain that I'm about to become a full-time caregiver for someone who's dying?" "You tell him the truth. You see how he responds. And Elena," Sarah reached for her hand, "if he can't handle the reality of your life right now, then he's not the right person for you anyway." Elena looked at her sister, at the fierce love in her eyes, the determination to keep fighting for Elena's happiness, even while facing her own mortality. "Are you sure?" Elena asked. "I'm sure. Go get dressed. Daniel will be here soon, and I want to meet him properly before you leave." When Daniel arrived at 10, Elena led him upstairs to Sarah's apartment instead of meeting him at the door. She'd decided Sarah was right. If this relationship was going to go anywhere, Daniel needed to understand what her life looked like right now. "Daniel," Elena said as they entered the living room, "this is my sister Sarah." Daniel approached Sarah's chair with the careful attention Elena had noticed him paying to everything else respectful, observant, present. Sarah was wearing a soft blue head wrap and had put on makeup for the occasion, but there was no hiding how ill she was. "Sarah," Daniel said, taking her outstretched hand gently. "Elena's told me so much about you. It's an honor to meet you." "The pleasure is mine. I've been looking forward to this meeting for months." Daniel glanced at Elena with raised eyebrows. "Months." "I have a confession to make," Sarah said with a smile that was purely mischievous despite her illness. "I've been planning this entire scenario since I found out about my diagnosis. The building research contacting you, getting Elena back to Portland, all of it was orchestrated." "Sarah," Elena protested, but Daniel was laughing. "I had a feeling," he said. "The timing was almost too perfect to be coincidental." "Are you angry?" Sarah asked. "About being manipulated?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "A week ago I might have been, but now—" He looked at Elena, something warm and genuine in his expression. "Now I'm just grateful." Sarah beamed. "Good answer. Elena, I like him even more than I expected." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sarah, please don't what embarrass you in front of the nice man you're falling for?" Sarah's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Elena, I'm dying. I've earned the right to be as meddlesome as I want." The casual way Sarah said, "I'm dying," made Elena flinch, but Daniel didn't seem fazed. He sat down on the edge of the coffee table, putting himself at Sarah's eye level. "How can I help?" he asked simply. Sarah's expression grew serious. "Take care of her. Not today, not this week, but after. Elena has spent so long taking care of other people that she's forgotten how to let anyone take care of her." "Sarah," Elena said, mortified, "you can't just—" "I can and I am." Sarah looked between Elena and Daniel. "You two have found each other at exactly the right moment. Don't waste it because you're afraid of the timing or the circumstances." Daniel reached over and took Elena's hand. "We won't waste it." The certainty in his voice, the easy way he included himself in Elena's future, made something flutter in Elena's chest. She squeezed his fingers, grateful for the anchor of his touch. "Good," Sarah said. "Now go have your coffee date, Mrs. Patterson will be here any minute, and I want to hear all about it when you get back." Daniel's surprise turned out to be a construction site in the Pearl District, a half-built residential complex that looked like it had been abandoned mid-project. "What is this place?" Elena asked as they parked across the street. "This," Daniel said, "is the Morrison Heights development. It was supposed to be luxury condos, but the developer ran out of funding 6 months ago. The city's been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since." Elena studied the half-finished buildings, noting the solid bones of the construction, the good natural light, the generous proportions of the spaces she could see through unfinished walls. "It's a good site," she said. "Good bones. Why are you showing it to me?" Daniel handed her a manila folder. "Because the city council is meeting next week to decide whether to demolish it or find a new developer. And because I think you might have some ideas about what it could become." Elena opened the folder and found architectural drawings, city planning documents, and financial projections. The original design was exactly what she'd expected: generic luxury housing that maximized profit while minimizing character. "Daniel, what is this about?" "When Sarah told me about your dream of designing affordable housing, I started thinking about opportunities in Portland. This site has been zoned for residential development, city utilities are already connected, and the foundation and structural work are done. Someone with vision could transform it into something extraordinary." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she studied the plans. The bones were good, the location was perfect, and the existing infrastructure meant construction costs would be significantly lower than starting from scratch. "The city would never approve affordable housing in the Pearl District," she said. "This is prime real estate. What if it were mixed-income housing, some market-rate units to help subsidize below-market ones? What if it were designed so beautifully that it became a model for how affordable housing could enhance a neighborhood instead of detracting from it?" Elena looked at Daniel, seeing the excitement in his expression. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been researching it. There are grant programs, city initiatives, private foundations that fund innovative housing projects. And Elena," Daniel pulled another document from the folder, "Professor Chen's estate includes a provision for funding educational and community development projects. His lawyer says there's enough money to provide seed funding for something like this. Elena's breath caught. You want me to apply for funding from Professor Chen's estate to build affordable housing on this site? I want you to consider the possibility. Sarah thinks you're ready to start creating again instead of just preserving. I think Portland needs what you could build here. Elena got out of the car and walked closer to the construction site, Daniel following behind her. She could see through the skeleton of the buildings into the spaces within raw and unfinished, but full of potential. In her mind, she began sketching possibilities. Units designed for families with flexible spaces that could adapt as children grew. Community areas that encouraged interaction between neighbors. Rooftop gardens that residents could tend together. Housing that felt like home, not just shelter. It would be a massive project, she said finally. Years of planning, construction, city approvals. And I've never managed anything this large. You wouldn't have to do it alone. There are firms in Portland that specialize in affordable housing development. You could partner with someone who has the business experience while you focus on design. Elena turned to face him. Why are you doing this? Why are you encouraging me to take on something so complicated when we barely know each other? Daniel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Yesterday, when you talked about wanting to create housing where families could build lives without sacrificing dignity, your whole face lit up. You look like someone who'd remembered what they were born to do. And I think people should get to do what they were born to do. I think the world needs more beautiful, thoughtful spaces. And I think, guys, Daniel paused, looking almost shy. I think I'd like to document the process. The story of how abandoned buildings become homes, how communities are built from nothing. Elena stared at him, understanding flooding through her. You want us to work together. I want to be part of whatever you build next in whatever way makes sense. As a documenter, as a supporter, as whatever you'll let me be. The honesty in his voice, the careful way he offered his partnership without assuming anything, made Elena's heart race. She looked back at the construction site, imagining it filled with families, with children playing in courtyards designed for safety and joy, with adults finding community in shared spaces. There would be so many obstacles, she said. Zoning challenges, funding, complications, city politics. Probably. And I'd have to quit my job in Seattle, find a way to rebuild my career here. Probably. And Sarah, Elena's voice caught, Sarah won't be here to see it finished. Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body despite the October chill. No, but she'll be here to see it started. And Elena, I think that would make her incredibly happy. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of possibility and fear pressing down on her chest. For 4 years, she'd kept her dreams small and safe, working on other people's projects, avoiding anything that required her to put herself and her vision on the line. But standing here looking at empty buildings that could become homes, she felt something stirring that she'd thought was lost forever. I'd need to see the full financial projections, she said finally, and talk to city planners about zoning requirements, and find potential partners who understand community-focused development. Daniel's smile was radiant. Is that a yes? It's a maybe, a strong maybe. I'll take it. Elena looked at the construction site again this time, seeing not just possibilities but actual plans forming in her mind. Unit layouts that maximize natural light and privacy, community spaces that encouraged interaction without forcing it, design elements that honored the industrial character of the neighborhood while creating something warm and livable. Daniel, she said suddenly, what you said about documenting the process, what did you mean exactly? I was thinking about a multimedia project, photographs, interviews, video. The story of how housing gets built, who gets to live where, what makes a place feel like home. It could be part of my Forgotten Stories series, but looking forward instead of backward. You'd want to interview residents, document their experiences. Only with their permission. The goal would be to change the narrative around affordable housing to show that well-designed community development strengthens neighborhoods instead of weakening them. Elena felt a thrill of excitement. The combination of architecture and storytelling of creating something beautiful and documenting its impact on real people's lives. It was exactly the kind of work she dreamed of doing when she first started studying architecture. We should go, she said suddenly. I want to show Sarah the plans while we can still get her input. Daniel's expression grew gentle. How is she doing really? Weeks, Elena said quietly. Maybe less. She started hospice care today. Elena, I'm so sorry. Do you want to postpone? No. Elena's voice was firm. Sarah was very clear about that. She doesn't want me to put my life on hold because she's dying. And honestly, Elena looked back at the construction site one more time. I think she'd love this project. She'd love the idea of me building something that could outlast all of us. They drove back to Sarah's apartment in comfortable silence, Elena's mind spinning with possibilities, while Daniel navigated the familiar streets of the city she was beginning to think of as home again. The rain had stopped and weak autumn sunshine was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in soft golden light. Elena, Daniel said as they pulled up in front of Sarah's building, whatever happens with the housing project, whatever happens with us, I want you to know that meeting you has already changed my life. Elena unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to get out of the car. How? For 4 years I've been stuck, moving through life but not really living it, documenting other people's stories because I was afraid to have one of my own. Yesterday when I saw you looking at that building, your building, I remembered what it felt like to believe in something. Elena reached over and touched his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. I know the feeling. I'd forgotten what it was like to want something I couldn't control. And now I'm terrified and excited and more awake than I've been in years. Daniel turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, and Elena felt something click into place in her chest. Not the desperate, anxious attachment she'd felt in her early 20s, but something steadier and more grounded. The sense that she'd found someone who saw her clearly and wasn't afraid of what he saw. Go show Sarah the plans, Daniel said. I'll call my contact at the city planning office and see if we can get a meeting this week. If you want me, if you think I can be helpful. Elena leaned across the center console and kissed him soft and brief, but full of promise. I want you. For this, for whatever comes next. Daniel's smile was warm and genuine and completely unguarded. Then let's build something beautiful. Sarah was asleep when Elena came back upstairs, her breathing shallow but steady. Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor from the first floor, was sitting in the kitchen reading a paperback novel. How is she? Elena asked quietly. Tired but comfortable. The pain medication is helping. Mrs. Patterson closed her book and stood up. She woke up about an hour ago asking if you were back yet. She seemed excited about something. Elena smiled. She's always excited about something. Thank you for sitting with her. Of course, dear. I'll be back this evening if you want to go out again. After Mrs. Patterson left, Elena made herself a cup of tea and spread Daniel's folder across the kitchen table. The financial projections, zoning documents, and architectural plans told the story of a project that was ambitious but not impossible, complicated but not insurmountable. More importantly, it was the kind of work that could matter. Housing that could change lives, architecture that could strengthen communities, design that could prove that beauty and affordability weren't mutually exclusive. Elena, Sarah's voice was weak but alert. Elena went to the living room and found her sister sitting up looking more alert than she had all morning. How was your coffee date? Sarah asked. It wasn't exactly coffee. Elena sat down next to her and opened the folder. Sarah, I want to show you something. For the next hour, Elena walked Sarah through Daniel's proposal, the construction site, the possibilities for creating affordable housing that could serve as a model for other developments. Sarah asked sharp questions about financing, zoning, timeline, and community impact. Despite her illness, her mind was still razor sharp when it came to analyzing complex projects. It's ambitious, Sarah said finally. Probably more ambitious than anything you have tackled before. I know, that's what scares me. That's what should excite you. Sarah studied the architectural drawings again. Elena, this is the work you should be doing. This is why you became an architect. What if I fail? What if the city won't approve it, or I can't secure funding, or I'm not experienced enough to manage something this complex? Sarah reached for Elena's hand. What if you succeed? What if you create something extraordinary? What if you prove that affordable housing can be beautiful, and that communities can be strengthened by thoughtful development? Elena looked at the plans scattered across Sarah's coffee table, imagining them realized as actual buildings where real families would build real lives. It would take years, 3 years minimum from planning to completion. Good. You need a reason to stay in Portland, to build a life here instead of just marking time. Sarah, Elena, listen to me. I'm dying and there's nothing either of us can do about that. But you're not dying. You have decades ahead of you, and I refuse to let you waste them hiding from the possibility of creating something meaningful. Elena felt tears threatening again. I don't know how to do this without you, how to make big decisions, how to take risks, how to trust that things will work out. You'll learn, and Elena. Sarah squeezed her hand. You won't be doing it alone. Daniel wants to be part of whatever you build next. Let him. It's too soon. We've known each other for 2 days. I knew I loved your father's family the first day I met them. Sometimes the heart recognizes what it needs faster than the mind can process it. Elena looked around Sarah's apartment at the photographs and books and carefully chosen objects that told the story of a life lived with intention and love. In a few weeks, this space would be empty and Sarah would be gone, and Elena would have to figure out how to keep living without the person who'd taught her how to build a family out of chosen love. But maybe that was exactly why she should take the risk. Maybe the best way to honor Sarah's memory was to be brave enough to build something lasting and beautiful, something that could house other families, other chosen loves, other stories of people finding their way home. Okay, Elena said finally. I'll do it. I'll apply for funding, meet with city planners, find development partners. I'll try to build something extraordinary. Sarah's smile was radiant. Good, and Elena, when you break ground on the first building, when you hold the keys to the first completed unit, when you see the first family move into a home you designed, remember that I was here for the beginning. Remember that I got to see you choose to be brave. Lena leaned over and hugged her sister, breathing in the familiar scent that was already beginning to fade. I love you, Sarah. I love you too. Now call Daniel and tell him you're ready to change the world. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, planning sessions, and quiet moments with Sarah as her condition gradually worsened. Elena threw herself into the housing project with an intensity that surprised her, spending her days as researching funding sources and zoning requirements, while her evenings were devoted to caring for Sarah. Daniel was a constant presence, attending meetings when Elena needed support, sitting with Sarah, when Elena needed to run errands, documenting the early stages of the project with the thoughtful attention he brought to all his work. He seemed to understand instinctively when Elena needed space to process her grief and when she needed company to distract from it. The city planning meeting went better than Elena had expected. The Pearl District had been struggling with criticism about gentrification and lack of affordable housing options. A well-designed mixed-income development could help address both issues while providing a model for future projects. The funding applications were more complex, requiring detailed financial projections and community impact studies. But Professor Chen's estate provided enough seed funding to hire consultants and complete the preliminary work needed for larger grant applications. Most importantly, Elena found development partners who shared her vision. Morrison and Associates was a Portland firm that specialized in affordable housing with a track record of successful projects and strong relationships with community organizations. When Elena presented her initial designs, their enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. This could be groundbreaking, said Janet Morrison, the firm's principal. The combination of architectural innovation and community focus, this is exactly what Portland needs. Through it all, Sarah remained Elena's fiercest supporter and sharpest critic. Even as her energy waned, she continued to review plans, ask probing questions, and push Elena to think bigger and bolder. Don't just create housing, Sarah said during one of their late-night planning sessions. Create community. Create spaces where people can build the kinds of chosen families we've had. Elena incorporated Sarah's feedback into every aspect of the design. Shared gardens, where neighbors could grow food together. Flexible community spaces that could host everything from children's birthday parties to adult education classes. Affordable units that were indistinguishable from market rate ones, ensuring that economic diversity didn't translate to visual segregation. Daniel documented everything: the planning meetings, the design sessions, Elena's late-night sketching sessions at Sarah's kitchen table. But he also captured quieter moments: Elena reading to Sarah when she was too tired to focus on plans, Sarah's careful review of architectural drawings, even when holding a pencil required enormous effort, the way Elena's face lit up when she talked about the community spaces she was designing. This is going to be an extraordinary story, Daniel told Elena one evening as they walked through the Pearl District. Elena pointing out details she wanted to incorporate into the final design. Not just the housing project, but the process. The way you found your passion again in the middle of loss. I couldn't have done it without you, Elena said, or without Sarah pushing me to be braver than I thought possible. How is she today? Elena was quiet for a moment. Weaker. The hospice nurse thinks it won't be much longer. Daniel stopped walking and pulled Elena into his arms right there on the sidewalk with evening traffic flowing around them. She leaned into his embrace, grateful for the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Whatever happens, Daniel said quietly, we'll get through it together. Elena pulled back to look at his face in the streetlight. In 3 weeks, she'd learned to read his expressions, to recognize the quiet intensity he brought to everything he cared about. She'd also learned that she trusted him in ways that should have scared her, but somehow didn't. Daniel, she said, I'm falling in love with you. His smile was soft and wondering. I'm already there. Even though we met in the middle of crisis, even though my sister orchestrated our entire relationship, even though everything is complicated and uncertain, especially because of all that, Elena love isn't about perfect timing or ideal circumstances. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be braver than you thought possible. Elena kissed him, then soft and deep and full of promise. Around them, Portland settled into its evening rhythm, the city lights reflecting off wet streets, the smell of coffee and rain and possibility filling the air. When they finally pulled apart, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face them alone. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in November, while Elena was sitting beside her bed reading aloud from a book of poetry they'd both loved in college. Her passing was gentle, so quiet that Elena didn't immediately realize it had happened. One moment Sarah was breathing, the next, she simply wasn't, as if she'd decided the poem was a good place to stop. Elena sat with her for a long time after holding Sarah's hand and trying to memorize everything about this moment, the way the morning light fell across Sarah's face, the peaceful expression that suggested she'd found whatever she was looking for, the profound silence that filled the room like a blessing. When she finally called Daniel, she didn't need to say anything. He heard everything in her voice. I'll be right there, he said. The next few days passed in the surreal haze that accompanies death funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, well-meaning visitors who brought casseroles and condolences. Elena moved through it all with the careful attention to detail that had served her well in architecture, making lists and checking items off and focusing on concrete tasks that had clear solutions. Daniel was a quiet, constant presence handling logistics when Elena couldn't, providing steady support without trying to manage her grief. He seemed to understand that what Elena needed was not to be rescued from her sadness, but to be accompanied through it. The memorial service was small and perfect, exactly what Sarah would have wanted. Elena spoke about Sarah's fierce love, her meddlesome nature, her insistence that life was too short to waste on fear. Daniel shared photographs he'd taken of Sarah during her final weeks, images that had captured not her illness, but her vitality, her sharp intelligence, her obvious delight in the love story she'd orchestrated. After the service, Elena stood in Sarah's empty apartment and felt the weight of her new reality. Sarah was gone, and Elena was alone again, but somehow the loneliness felt different this time, less like abandonment and more like space to grow into. What happens now? Daniel asked, finding her standing in the kitchen where they'd spent so many hours planning the housing project. Now I finish what we started, Elena said. I build something Sarah would be proud of. We build something, Daniel corrected gently, if you still want a partner. Elena looked around the apartment one more time, then took Daniel's hand. Let's go home. Your place or mine? Elena smiled, feeling something light and hopeful stirring in her chest. Ours. Let's go to our house and figure out how to build something beautiful. 6 months later, Elena stood on the construction site that had once been the abandoned Morrison Heights development, watching as the framing crew raised the walls of what would become the first affordable housing unit. The sound of hammers and power tools filled the air, along with the voices of workers calling to each other in Spanish and English. Daniel was somewhere nearby, documenting the construction process with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything else. His Building Home photo series had already attracted national attention, and a New York gallery was planning an exhibition for the fall. But Elena wasn't thinking about media attention or national recognition. She was thinking about the family who would move into this unit in 8 months, a single mother and her two children who were currently living in a cramped studio apartment across town. She was thinking about the community garden that would occupy the courtyard space, the shared kitchen where neighbors would teach each other family recipes, the children's play area designed to be visible from multiple apartments so kids could play safely while parents kept an eye on them from their windows. "Beautiful work," said a voice behind her. Elena turned to find Janet Morrison approaching, her hard hat slightly askew and her expression pleased. The partnership with Morrison and Associates had exceeded everyone's expectations, with Elena's design vision meshing perfectly with the firm's experience in affordable housing development. "It's starting to look real," Elena said, studying the emerging structure. "More than real. This project is already being used as a model by other cities. The waiting list for units is over 200 families long." Elena felt a familiar thrill of pride and terror. The success of the project meant opportunities for more work, larger developments, the chance to build the career she'd always dreamed of. It also meant increased responsibility, higher stakes, more chances for things to go wrong. But 6 months of construction supervision had taught her something. Sarah had always known the possibility of failure was just part of the cost of trying to create something meaningful. "Elena," Janet said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket, "I wanted to give you this. It came to the office yesterday." Elena opened the envelope and found a letter from the mayor's office. The city was inviting her to participate in a task force on innovative housing solutions, with the goal of developing policies to encourage more projects like Morrison Heights. "Policy work," Elena said, scanning the letter. "That's new territory. But important territory. The design work is just the beginning. If you want to create systemic change, you need to help shape the policies that govern development." Elena folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. More opportunities, more chances to make a difference, more ways her work could outlast her. Sarah would have been proud. "I'll think about it," Elena said. "But first, let's get this project finished." Janet smiled and headed back toward the construction trailer, leaving Elena alone with the sound of building and the sight of her vision taking shape in steel and wood and concrete. "Deep thoughts," Daniel's voice came from behind her. Elena turned to find him approaching with his camera slung over his shoulder and a smile that still made her heart race 6 months after their first meeting. "Thinking about Sarah," Elena said, "about what she'd say if she could see this." "She'd probably take credit for the whole thing." Elena laughed. "She absolutely would, and she'd be planning the next project before this one was finished." Daniel slipped his arms around her waist, and Elena leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. They'd moved in together 3 months ago, combining their lives with the same thoughtful attention they brought to their work. Daniel's photography and Elena's architecture complemented each other in ways that continued to surprise them both. "Speaking of next projects," Daniel said, "I got a call from a documentary filmmaker in Los Angeles. She wants to make a film about the Morrison Heights project, about affordable housing as community development." "What did you tell her?" "That she should talk to the lead architect." Elena turned in his arms to face him. "This is your story too. Your photographs, your documentation, that's been just as important as the design work." "Our story," Daniel corrected. "The story of what we built together." Elena looked around the construction site, at the workers building homes for families they'd never meet, at the space that would soon house a community of chosen families and shared dreams. In 8 months, this place would be full of life, children learning to ride bicycles in the courtyards, adults sharing meals in the community kitchen, neighbors becoming friends over shared gardens, and spontaneous block parties. It wasn't the life Elena had planned when she first left Portland 4 years ago. It wasn't the safe, controlled existence she'd built in Seattle, but it was real and messy and full of possibility, and for the first time in her adult life, Elena felt like she was exactly where she belonged. "I love you," she said, reaching up to touch Daniel's face. "I love you too. Even when I'm stressed about construction deadlines and city permits, and whether we're creating something that will actually serve the community the way we intended. Especially then. Elena, you worry about those things because you care about doing work that matters. That's one of the things I love most about you." Elena kissed him soft and brief and full of gratitude for the man who'd appeared in her life at exactly the moment she was ready to stop hiding from possibility. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go home and plan our next project." What kind of project? Elena smiled, feeling Sarah's mischievous spirit hovering somewhere nearby, probably already planning to meddle in whatever came next. Something beautiful, Elena said. Something that will outlast us both. They walked hand in hand toward Daniel's car, leaving behind the sound of construction and the sight of dreams taking shape in wood and steel. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more permits, more challenges to navigate as they worked to complete the vision they'd started together. But tonight they would go home to the house Professor Chen had prepared for Elena's return, to the space where they'd learned to build a life together out of shared loss and chosen love, in the radical act of believing that broken things could be made whole again. Behind them, the construction continued, workers building homes for families they'd never meet, creating spaces where new stories could unfold. And somewhere in the distance, Portland settled into its evening rhythm, rain beginning to fall in the gentle, persistent way that washed the city clean and prepared it for whatever came next. 2 years later, the grand opening of Morrison Heights was held on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after Elena had first returned to Portland. The development was everything she'd envisioned and more: 120 units of mixed-income housing arranged around courtyards and community spaces that buzzed with life. Children played on equipment designed for safety and imagination, while their parents chatted on benches positioned to encourage conversation. The community garden was in full autumn bloom, with residents tending plots of vegetables and herbs they'd share at the monthly potluck dinners. Elena stood at the edge of the main courtyard, watching families move through spaces she'd designed, and felt a profound sense of completion. Not an ending, but the fulfillment of a promise she'd made to Sarah, to Professor Chen, to herself. Nervous, Daniel asked, joining her with 2 cups of coffee from the vendor they'd hired for the celebration. Elena said, accepting the warm cup gratefully, and grateful and a little overwhelmed. Daniel had been documenting the day, since dawn, capturing the excitement of families receiving their keys, the joy of children discovering their new playground, the quiet satisfaction of elderly residents settling into the community room with their morning papers. His Building Home series had become a traveling exhibition, currently showing in museums across the country and inspiring other cities to reconsider their approach to affordable housing. The mayor's here, Daniel said, nodding toward a cluster of people near the community center, along with representatives from 3 other cities who want to discuss replicating the model. And the documentary crew, setting up interviews with residents. Maria from Unit 3B is telling everyone how her daughter finally has her own room for the first time in her life. Elena smiled, thinking of Maria, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and was now studying for her nursing degree in the community center's dedicated study space. Dedicated study. Stories like hers were exactly what Elena had hoped to make possible when she'd first seen the abandoned construction site 2 years ago. Elena, a familiar voice called out across the courtyard. Elena turned to see Janet Morrison approaching with a woman she didn't recognize. Professional attire, confident, stride the bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Elena, I'd like you to meet Dr. Catherine Wu from the Urban Housing Initiative, Janet said. She's been following the Morrison Heights project from the beginning. Ms. Hayes, Dr. Wu said, extending her hand, I've been hoping to meet you. Your work here has implications far beyond Portland. We're interested in discussing funding for similar projects in 5 other cities. Elena felt the familiar thrill of opportunity mixed with the weight of responsibility. More projects meant more families housed, more communities, strengthened more chances to prove that beautiful, affordable housing could transform neighborhoods. It also meant more complexity, more stakeholders to manage, more ways things could go wrong. But she'd learned to embrace that tension. The possibility of failure was just the price of trying to create something meaningful. I'd be very interested in that conversation, Elena said. But first, let me show you around the project. I think you'll find the community spaces particularly innovative. As they walked through the development, Elena found herself telling the story that had become familiar over the past months, how abandoned buildings could become homes, how thoughtful design could foster community, how affordable housing could enhance rather than detract from a neighborhood. But today, surrounded by the reality of families living the life she'd envisioned, the story felt different. Less like a pitch and more like proof. They paused at the memorial garden Elena had designed in a quiet corner of the development, a small space with benches arranged around a fountain, native plants chosen for their beauty in every season, and a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Sarah Chen and Professor William Chen, who believed in the power of chosen families and beautiful spaces. "This is lovely," Dr. Wu said, a nice touch honoring the project's origins. Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking of Sarah's insistence that she choose courage over safety, of Professor Chen's faith in her vision, even when she couldn't see it herself. They weren't here to see the finished project, but they were present in every decision Elena had made, every space she'd designed, with their voices echoing in her mind. "They were the reason I came back to Portland," Elena said finally, "and the reason I found the courage to try something this ambitious. Well, their investment has paid remarkable dividends. This project is already influencing policy discussions at the federal level." Elena nodded, but her attention was drawn to a cluster of children who had discovered the climbing structure. Daniel had helped her design a piece that looked like abstract art, but functioned as a playground, encouraging creative play while fitting seamlessly into the overall aesthetic of the development. One of the children, a girl of maybe 6 with pigtails and paint-stained fingers, had climbed to the top of the structure and was calling down to her friends below. "Look how high I can go. I can see everything from up here." Elena watched the girl's face light up with accomplishment and joy, and felt a rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. This was why she'd become an architect, not to create monuments to her own vision, but to make spaces where people could flourish, where children could discover their own courage, where families could build lives worthy of their dreams. "Elena," Daniel appeared at her elbow, camera in hand, but lowered. "The documentary crew wants to interview you about the design process. Are you ready?" Elena looked around the courtyard one more time, at the families settling into their new homes, at the neighbors already forming friendships over shared garden plots, at the children claiming their spaces with the confidence that came from having a place to belong. "I'm ready," she said. As they walked toward the community center where the interview would take place, Elena felt a hand slip into hers. Daniel's fingers, warm and calloused from camera work, steady and sure. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "Seeing your vision become reality." Elena considered the question, watching a group of teenagers who had already claimed the community room's ping pong table as their territory. "Like the beginning of something bigger than I imagined. The other projects, the national attention, all of that, but also—" Elena paused, struggling to find words for the feeling that had been growing in her chest all morning. "Like proof that Sarah was right, that choosing courage over safety, even when you're scared, even when you don't know how things will turn out, that's how you build a life worth living." Daniel squeezed her hand. "She'd be proud of you. She'd be planning the next project and wondering why we're standing around talking instead of getting to work." Daniel laughed. "True. So what is the next project?" Elena smiled, thinking of the preliminary sketches she'd been working on in the evenings, the conversations she'd been having with city planners in Seattle and San Francisco and Denver, the growing conviction that beautiful, affordable housing wasn't just possible but essential. "Something bigger," she said. "Something that will reach even more families, create even more communities. Something Sarah would approve of." They reached the community center where the documentary crew was waiting, with lights and cameras and the eager curiosity of people who recognized a good story when they saw one. Elena paused in the doorway, looking back at the courtyard where children played and adults chatted, and the ordinary magic of community unfolded in the spaces she'd designed. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to create spaces where people could build lives worthy of their dreams. But tonight she would go home with Daniel to the house Professor Chen had prepared for her return, and they would plan whatever came next with the same careful attention they brought to everything they built together. Behind them, Morrison Heights settled into its evening rhythm, lights coming on in windows, the sound of dinnertime conversations drifting from open doors, the gentle buzz of a community finding its voice. And somewhere in the distance, Portland prepared for another night of rain, the kind that washed the city clean and made everything ready for tomorrow's possibilities.